the hound's ribs pressed through its fur like ghost fingers. Each night, just before lights out, a woman in a tattered uniform would step from the barracks with something cupped in her hands. Crumbs, scraps, sometimes a sliver of bacon she had hidden from her tray. The dog waited near the fence post, tail wagging low, ears pinned back as if ashamed to hope. She whispered to it in Japanese. No one knew what she said. Until one night, a cowboy followed her. What he found was not just a prisoner feeding a dog. It was a ritual, a secret, a surrender of something deeper than hunger. The dog, it turned out, wasn't a guard animal. It was a stray that wandered into the camp months earlier, mangy, limping, unclaimed, like her. The woman wasn't breaking rules. She was trying to keep something alive. When the cowboy saw the dog nuzzle her hand and her tears fall quietly onto the dirt, he didn't report it. He sat down beside her. The hound licked her fingers. It made a soft, snuffling sound, almost like gratitude, and then lay down with its head against her knee. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't smile either. She simply lowered her hand and let it rest on the dog's scruff, like it belonged there. For a long time, neither of them spoke, one because she didn't know how, and the other because he suddenly had nothing to say. They had been watching her for weeks now. Something wasn't adding up. The kitchen ledger was short. The eggs didn't balance out. And one morning, a guard swore he'd seen her palm something under her tray. Not much, a smear of fat, maybe a corner of bread, but it was enough to spark the usual procedure. They searched the barracks, turned out bedding, even checked beneath the floor slats. Nothing. The prisoners, all women, all silent, watched with the dull-eyed fatigue of people long past surprise. Then someone mentioned the quiet one, the one who barely spoke, who lined up each, mourning with her shoulders drawn tight and her gaze always lowered. The one who, just before lights out, slipped out past the latrine and disappeared into the far yard for a few minutes. She never took anything with her. Never came back with anything either. But she vanished into that golden light like smoke. So the cowboy followed her. He told himself it was duty, but really it was curiosity, or maybe suspicion, curled up inside something more complicated. He found her behind the barracks, by the old fence line that bordered the livestock yard. There, crouched in the dirt, was the woman with her hand outstretched, and the dog. It wasn't one of theirs, not officially. It had wandered into camp months ago, skinny and limping, half a tail, one ear torn. At first, they tried to chase it off, but it kept coming back, never bit, never barked, just watched, just waited. Eventually, it became like the wind or the dust, something that belonged without permission. The guards called it a pest. The prisoners, for the most part, ignored it, but not her. That night, the cowboy watched her feed it something from her pocket. He couldn't see what. Maybe it was a crust of bread, maybe just a few licks of grease rubbed into her fingers. Whatever it was, the dog treated it like treasure, and when she looked up and saw him standing there, her eyes widened, not in fear, but in something more fragile. She thought for just a moment that she'd be punished. He didn't move, just took off his hat and crouched beside her. The dog sniffed at him. Its tail gave a lazy thump against the dirt. He glanced sideways and saw her hands trembling. The bones in her wrists looked like bird wings, delicate and sharp. She said nothing, but her whole body was waiting for the order to stand, to stop, to explain. Instead, he reached into his own pocket and pulled out a bit of biscuit he'd been saving. Broke it in half, placed the piece beside hers in the dirt. The dog devoured it without hesitation. They sat in silence after that, two figures in the fading sun, sharing scraps with a stray creature that no one else claimed. The moment felt strange, suspended, like something too small to matter and too important to forget. Later, he'd return to the barracks and say nothing to the others. He wouldn't mention the biscuit, wouldn't note the way her fingers had lingered in the dog's fur. It didn't feel like a rule had been broken. It felt like a secret had been kept. That night, the food ledger balanced again. But the next evening, just before lights out, the cowboy found himself watching the backyard once more. And when he saw her silhouette slip into the golden light with something cupped in her palms, he didn't stop her. He tipped his hat and let her go. The sound of her footsteps disappeared into the night. But in the silence that followed, another sound took its place, the soft, rhythmic breathing of the dog beside her. Naoko lowered her hand, brushing the dirt from her knees, and stared at the stars above, her thoughts far from the camp, far from the barbed wire and the guards. In that moment, she wasn't a prisoner. She was just a woman sitting next to an animal, no uniforms, no weapons, no war, just the two of them. But Naoko's thoughts had traveled elsewhere, far away to another place, another time. In the quiet alleys of Yokohama, there had been another Hoshiko. She hadn't been a stray, not really, not to Naoko. To her, the small dog had been family. Found under a ruined temple, trembling from the cold, Hoshiko had been more than just a pet. She was a child of the stars, as Naoko had called her, named after the flickering lights in the night sky that had once filled the city before the air raids. A stray, yes, but to Naoko she was a companion, a warm, beating thing in a world filled with death. The world was different then. When she was a child, Naoko's home had still smelled like rice and fresh sea air. Her mother had a laugh that carried across the small, cluttered apartment. There were neighbors who smiled and shared rice cakes with her, and streets full of children who ran past in the summer heat, their laughter drowning out the distant hum of war. She'd never imagined that one day she'd be sitting in a cold camp thousands of miles away from those days, clutching a piece of stale bread, wondering if she'd ever see home again. Then came the bombs. The first time Naoko heard the drone of Allied planes overhead, she'd been sitting on the steps of her house, watching the horizon stretch out over the water. The air had been warm, and the sky had seemed endless. But that night, the darkness split open with flashes of light, and the city of Yokohama began to burn. Her mother's laughter was swallowed by the scream of sirens. The familiar streets turned to ash, and Naoko's childhood evaporated in the flames. She ran to find her mother, but the smoke was thick and suffocating. By the time she reached home, her house was gone. In the distance, a fire burned where the temple stood, the same temple where Hoshiko had been found. She couldn't find her dog that night. She couldn't find anyone. Naoko found herself wandering the streets, the air alive with fire and fear. It was as if the very city had been swept away, leaving only her and a handful of others. She clutched a bag of rice, some salted fish, and her last remaining letters from friends she could no longer reach. The country she had once known was dying in the ashes, its walls collapsing just like her family's home. There was no time to mourn. There was only survival. Weeks later, Naoko was sent to work as a medical assistant at a military hospital. She patched wounds, cleaned instruments, and moved silently. Through the chaos, always with one thought echoing in her mind: how to survive until the war ended. She had never thought she'd be left with nothing, but now she was a tool of the war machine. She did as she was told, no questions, no defiance. But when she closed her eyes at night, she still heard Hoshiko's soft whimper, felt the warmth of her fur, and the softness of her little paws pressing into her skin. Then came the surrender. It was supposed to be a moment of relief. The Emperor's voice on the radio was a strange, distant sound. "Endure the unendurable," he said, his words hollow against the noise of a country falling apart. But to Naoko, those words were only a prelude to something darker, the collapse of everything she had known. They had told her to never surrender, that to be captured by the Americans meant disgrace. But nothing prepared her for the disorientation of being shipped across the Pacific, a prisoner of war bound for a strange land where enemies became something else altogether. And now, this camp. The new Hoshiko was different. She was ragged and hungry, far from the joyful creature Naoko had once known. Yet, in a way, the dog had become something more than that, the last piece of life she dared to touch in this foreign land. Every evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, she would slip away to feed the stray, keeping a ritual alive, holding on to a piece of the past that she could still control. This dog, in its mangy, broken form, became her anchor. It wasn't just food she gave it. It was a promise, a reminder that there was still something worth saving. In the darkness of the camp, it was the one thing that refused to die, and for Naoko, that made all the difference. The camp grew quieter as the days passed, but Naoko's ritual remained unchanged. She kept the hound alive, and in doing so, she kept a part of herself from breaking. It was small, fragile, but it was hers. And in that small act of care, in the feeding, of a dog that no one cared for but her, Naoko found a way to survive the worst of the war. Inside the camp, words were currency. They had weight, and if you spoke too much, you risked losing everything. The prisoners who came from the wreckage of Japan carried the burden of silence like a shield, because silence meant survival. There was no room for anything else. The other women in the camp, most of them older than Naoko, kept their distance. They spoke in hushed tones, exchanged glances, and never shared too much. Their conversations were cautious, their laughter rare. The air itself seemed to bristle with the unspoken understanding that no one here was really free. There were guards to fear, orders to follow, and eyes that saw too much. Naoko didn't speak much, not because she didn't want to, but because she had been conditioned not to. The war had made her mute in ways the world couldn't see. Before the capture, in the hospital corridors, filled with the screams of wounded soldiers, she had learned that silence was her safest ally. She was an invisible cog in the machine, an assistant who carried clean sheets and fetched bandages, never raising her voice, never speaking her thoughts. Her words had no place in the war. Only her actions mattered. But silence, she discovered, was also a cage. When the Americans came, their kindness felt like a trick. They were supposed to be the enemy. They were supposed to despise her, to humiliate her for what she had done, for the things she had believed in. But when they offered her food, a blanket, a cigarette, she saw no hatred in their eyes, just something that felt like pity. Pity was worse than hate. It was something she didn't know how to respond to. The kindness felt wrong, not in the way cruelty would have, but in the way an open door might feel to someone who had been raised to believe the world was meant to be locked. The other women felt the same. They didn't trust the guards. They didn't trust the food. Some even threw it away when no one was looking, as if to eat it would be to accept their own shame. In the nights, when the lights dimmed, you could hear their whispers, faint, like secrets they didn't dare to speak too loudly. Some cried, some prayed, but always, always, there was the sound of silence filling the barracks like smoke. The silence was the one thing that bound them together, that kept them from fully breaking. But the hound didn't need words. It didn't need to be taught to distrust or to fear. It just needed scraps. Naoko found herself slipping away each night, the world around her quiet and vast, and in the stillness she would feed the dog. At first it was just food, bits of bread, the smallest morsels from her tray, things that didn't matter in the grand scheme of survival. But as time passed, Naoko began to understand the true value of this act. The dog didn't judge. It didn't ask questions. It didn't turn its back when she fed it. It just licked her hand, and in those moments, Naoko found herself doing something she hadn't done in so long: giving. It was strange, but in giving something so simple, she felt a flicker of something that hadn't been there for months. Peace. The kind of peace that doesn't come from silence or stillness, but from connection. The Hound didn't care that she was a prisoner. It didn't care that she had lost her family or her home or the life she once knew. It only cared that she was there, offering it food, offering it care. In return, it offered her nothing but quiet. And somehow, that was enough. The silence didn't disappear. It was still there, thick and suffocating in the barracks. But when Naoko knelt beside the Hound, she felt, for the first time in a long while, that she wasn't alone in it. The next morning, the camp stirred to life in the usual rhythm. The morning call, the shuffle of feet, the guards' footsteps pacing the gravel paths. Yet there was something different in the air, something that prickled at the back of Naoko's neck as she stretched awake. The sound was small at first, the soft scrape of paws against dirt, a familiar shuffle that was not quite the same as the usual scuffing of prisoners' feet. It was the Hound. It limped into the yard, dragging its right hind leg behind it like it was too heavy for its frail body. Naoko's breath caught in her chest as she saw the blood. It pooled on the ground beneath the dog's paw, dark against the dust of the camp. The animal's eyes were dull with pain, but it didn't run, didn't bark. It was too tired for that, too broken. The guards noticed immediately. One of them, he had a round face, a young man, reached for his rifle as the dog neared the barracks, its tail low and its legs shaking. He moved forward, but the dog retreated, frightened. Another guard shouted, raising his baton, "Get out of here! Get!" The air, once again, buzzed with tension. The camp held its collective breath. It was a moment frozen in time when everything seemed to shift and crack. Naoko felt the strange pull of something stirring inside her. There was no time to think, no room for hesitation. As the guards turned away, muttering among themselves, she stood up from her cot, trembling, not with fear, but with something else, something sharp, as if her whole body was a wire pulled tight. She moved toward the dog before she even knew what she was doing. The camp froze. No one spoke. The prisoners watched in silence, but their eyes followed her every movement. A prisoner, one of them, running toward the dog? Toward a guard animal? There was no protocol for this. The prisoners couldn't touch the animals. The guards couldn't. Yet here was Naoko, crossing the invisible line that no one dared to cross. The command to stop almost came, but it never did. The guards hesitated, unsure. What was she doing? She wasn't supposed to do this. She wasn't supposed to move, but Naoko didn't stop. She dropped to her knees beside the Hound, ripping a strip from her uniform with hands that shook. She wrapped it tightly around its leg, the blood soaking into the fabric as she tied the knot. The animal barely flinched, its eyes now looking up at her with a strange, calm acceptance. She didn't speak, she didn't make a sound, she just worked. When she finished, Naoko looked up. The guards' eyes were wide, filled with disbelief. But it wasn't just the guards, it was the entire camp. Every prisoner, every American watching had witnessed something that didn't make sense. The rules of war, of captivity, of survival were meant to be rigid. They weren't meant to bend. But here, in the dust, in the blood, in the quiet of that single moment, Naoko had shattered something unspoken. The bandage she had wrapped around the dog's leg was more than just a piece of cloth. It was a declaration, a simple act, but one that no one could ignore. She had given life. She had chosen to save something, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it might seem to everyone else. She had chosen to break the silence, to speak without words, and in doing so, she had not only defied the rules of captivity, she had defied the belief that life in this camp meant nothing. The dog, now able to move with some ease, limped away toward the fence, but this time it didn't move with fear. It walked slowly, cautiously, but there was a lightness to its steps. Naoko didn't move. She stayed kneeling, her hands still trembling slightly, her eyes fixed on the dog, watching as it disappeared behind the barracks. The air around her was still heavy, but it had changed somehow. The camp had witnessed something no one could undo. The guards stood in silence, unsure of what to do. Some of the women, still standing at the edge of the yard, exchanged glances, their eyes wide, unsure whether they had just seen a rebellion or an act of kindness. Perhaps for the first time since their arrival, they realized that kindness, however small, had its place even here. As Naoko stood, the world felt quieter. Her breath was shallow, but her heart beat steady, a rhythm she had not felt in so long. The camp was still there, the barbed wire still circled them, but for one small moment, in the shadow of a bleeding dog, she had remembered what it was like to choose life. The next morning, things felt different, a slight shift in the rhythm of camp life. The prisoners were still watched carefully, but no one seemed to mention the dog's injury. No reprimands, no orders. The camp moved forward, as it always did, but now, Naoko noticed, there was a subtle change in the way the guards looked at her. Not with suspicion, not with anger, but with something else, a curiosity. That afternoon, as the women worked in the fields, a cowboy, Davis, approached her. He wasn't like the others, more reserved, quieter. He carried a sack of feed over his shoulder and didn't seem to be in any hurry. Davis had been one of the first to show kindness to the prisoners, though it had been little more than a nod, a passing glance. Today he stood before Naoko, a slight frown on his face. He glanced over his shoulder to make sure no one else was near, and then, as though it were an afterthought, asked in his halting English, "What's the dog's name?" Naoko looked at him, startled by the question. It wasn't an accusation, not a command, but an inquiry, something that had no reason to be asked in a place like this. She took a breath and answered softly, as if giving the dog a name might make it real again, might make it her own. "Hoshiko," she said. Davis nodded slowly, as though turning the name over in his mind. Without saying anything more, he reached into his sack, pulled out a few extra scraps of bread and meat, and placed them by the fence. Naoko stood still, unsure of what to do, watching him closely. The next morning, Davis returned. The feed bucket had a scrap of paper on it, a pencil scrawl that read, "Hoshiko." It was small, barely noticeable against the rough wood of the bucket, but it felt like a recognition, a mark of something human amidst the machinery of the camp. The name was more than just a word. It was a promise, a soft rebellion against the endless namelessness the prisoners had been subjected to. For so long, they had been reduced to numbers, to faceless figures in a sea of bodies. But here, Davis had written a name. The dog had a place. Hoshiko was not a stray. She was someone. For Naoko, the quiet alliance with Davis was a strange thing to process. She had been taught to distrust every inch of this camp, to see only cruelty where there was none. Yet here, in the small space between a cowboy and a prisoner, she saw something she had not expected: humanity. He didn't speak of it. He didn't acknowledge it. But every time he left food by the fence for Hoshiko, every time he casually mentioned the dog's name, he was giving her something she had thought lost forever: dignity. And in return, she gave him something too: a name. It was no longer just about survival. It was about remembering, about asserting that they were not forgotten. Hoshiko wasn't just a dog. She was a sign that even in a world built on cruelty, small acts of care could still break through. The other prisoners, too, began to soften in their dealings with the Americans. They hadn't forgotten what the war had taken from them, but for the first time they began to understand that not every American soldier was a part of the machine they had fought against. And in that understanding they started to reclaim something of their own: a name, a face, a soul. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. The days passed, quiet as the wind across the dusty yard. Naoko continued her ritual, slipping food to the dog at dusk, each scrap a silent exchange between them. But with each passing day, something gnawed at her. Every morsel she gave to Hoshiko was another reminder of the hollow emptiness back home. Japan was far away, but its pain had never left her. Letters arrived sporadically, their edges worn from the long journey across the ocean. They came less often as the war dragged on, but each one was a lifeline, an aching, brutal connection to the world that had once been hers. When one came, Naoko held it tightly in her hands, reading the words over and over, as if memorizing them might help her understand what had happened to her country, to her family. One morning, as the prisoners gathered in the mess hall, a woman began to read aloud from a letter she had received. Her voice was quiet, tremulous, but the words carried through the room. "Children are eating bark," she said, pausing for a moment as if the words themselves were too much to bear. "Mothers are boiling paper for broth." The room went still. Naoko's stomach twisted. The image of her homeland, burned, broken, starved, became sharp and real in her mind. She had been so consumed by her own suffering, her own survival, that she had forgotten the faces of those who had not made it out of the ruins, those who were still starving while she sat here, eating warm meals every day. Her gaze fell to Hoshiko, who lay beside her on the floor, eyes half closed, waiting for the next scrap of food. She had been feeding this dog, this stray, and here, in this moment, it felt like a betrayal of her people. She was feeding an animal while her country starved. The weight of it pressed down on her chest, heavy, suffocating. But then, from the corner of the room, a voice broke the silence. It was soft, almost hesitant, but it carried the weight of truth. "We're all starving," the prisoner said, "but she's feeding something that listens." Naoko blinked, the words sinking in like stones in a still pond. She had been feeding Hoshiko to keep herself from going mad, to fill the silence, to hold on to something, anything left of the world she once knew. But she had not thought of it this way. She had not seen the act for what it truly was: an offering, a gift of life no matter how small, a quiet act of resistance against the overwhelming nothingness that surrounded them all. The woman who had spoken had a hollow look in her eyes, the kind that came from long years of hunger, loss, and grief. Yet there was a softness in her voice as she spoke of the dog. "She's feeding it," she said, "because it listens. It doesn't ask questions, doesn't turn its back. It's a lifeline." Naoko looked at the dog, now resting its head on her foot, its body small but solid against the cold floor. She had never thought of it that way. She had never considered that in her act of feeding she might be holding on to something greater than just survival. She was nurturing. She was giving life, small, fragile, and quiet though it might be, to something that would never ask for more than it was given. Her thoughts were interrupted as another woman came over, carrying a small bowl of rice. She placed it gently on the ground beside Naoko, not asking but giving. There was no pity in her eyes, no judgment, just a shared understanding, a bond between them. In that moment, Naoko realized that even here, in the midst of suffering, there was room for compassion. The food, the scraps, the rice. It wasn't just about survival. It was about remembering that life, even in its smallest forms, was still worth living. And in that shared understanding, in the act of giving what little they had, there was a dignity that transcended the brutality of war. It was a quiet rebellion against the despair that threatened to consume them all. As Naoko knelt beside Hoshiko, feeding her once again, she felt the weight of the world shift just slightly. Not enough to change everything, but enough to remind her that even in captivity, there was something worth holding on to. And perhaps, just perhaps, it was enough. One evening, when the camp was quiet and the rain fell steadily against the roof of the barracks, Naoko found herself standing at the edge of the yard, staring into the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth, the kind that felt heavy in your lungs. She could hear the distant sound of thunder rolling softly in the distance. The hound was near, its form barely visible through the curtain of rain. It wasn't a scheduled time for the feeding ritual, but the dog had become a constant presence in her life. Naoko felt its absence when it wasn't around, its eyes pulling her toward it as if silently demanding that she honor the quiet bond they had built. Without thinking, she stepped forward, her feet slipping in the mud as she moved toward the back of the camp. The small wooden chapel was tucked away near the edge of the property, its door half open, as if waiting for someone to enter. It had never been a place of prayer for Naoko. It was just another building on the edge of the camp, long since abandoned by the American soldiers who used it for little more than storage. But tonight, the stillness of the chapel called to her. She stepped inside, her clothes soaked through from the rain, the chill seeping into her bones. The dog followed her, limping slightly, its fur matted and wet, but it moved with a quiet urgency. She didn't speak when she entered the chapel, not to the dog, not to the empty pews. The only sound was the soft patter of rain against the roof and the creak of the chapel's wooden beams. Naoko sank to her knees on the worn floorboards, pulling the dog closer. She didn't need to pray, not really. She wasn't sure if she believed in God anymore, not after everything she had seen, after the war, after the destruction of her country. But in that moment, the chapel felt sacred. Not because of the religious symbols, but because it was a place of silence, a space where the world outside could be forgotten, if only for a few moments. She held the dog's head in her lap, her fingers stroking its damp fur. The dog lay still, its body warm against her legs, the steady rhythm of its breath filling the space between them. It was the first time in a long while that Naoko allowed herself to be vulnerable, to simply exist without the weight of the world pressing down on her. The dog's presence was comforting, a reminder that even in the most broken places there could still be peace. When the guard found them, hours later, the dog was still curled up at her feet, asleep. Naoko didn't react when he stepped inside, didn't even look up. She remained seated, her back against the cold stone wall, the dog's warmth the only thing that mattered. The guard didn't say anything at first, just stood in the doorway, watching them. He glanced around the chapel, then down at Naoko, his face unreadable. Finally, he spoke, his voice low. "It can stay here," he said, nodding toward the dog. "The chapel's empty anyway." Naoko said nothing in response, but the guard's words settled over her like a blanket, soft and strange. The dog would stay. She would not have to sneak away into the dark, away from the eyes of the others. In some quiet way, this small act of kindness felt like a bridge, a quiet understanding between the two of them. It wasn't an act of mercy. It was simply acceptance, a recognition of something that couldn't be explained. From that night on, the dog slept in the chapel. It became a quiet presence, a reminder that even here, in the heart of the camp, there could still be sanctuary. The dog, once just a stray, had become something more, something that represented not just survival, but the possibility of something else, something worth protecting. And in that chapel, Naoko found a small piece of peace, one that didn't come from silence or from the shadows of war, but from a bond she had forged in the stillness, in the rain, in the quiet company of a dog. Days blurred into one another, each one a repetition of the last, the early morning roll call, the dull labor in the fields, the watchful eyes of the guards, and then the nights that always seemed too long, the same uneasy silence wrapping around the barracks like a suffocating blanket. But in the midst of it all, there was the chapel, the small, humble space that had come to mean something more to Naoko than any of the other places in the camp. The dog's steady presence gave her comfort she hadn't thought she could feel again. One afternoon, a guard handed Naoko a pencil and a piece of paper. There was no reason for it, no instructions or commands, just the simple offering of writing supplies, as if they had no meaning in a place like this. At first, Naoko didn't understand. The paper felt heavy in her hands, an unfamiliar weight in a world that had stripped her of everything. It was so simple, this piece of paper, and yet it seemed impossibly distant from her life. The blank page stared back at her, offering no answers. Instead, Naoko looked down at the floor, where Hoshiko lay curled in a ball, its small body rising and falling with each breath. The dog's presence was a quiet, constant thing, and in the stillness of the camp, it had become her only companion. Naoko's eyes lingered on the dog's paw, the way it rested against the floor. Without thinking, she dipped the dog's paw in mud from the corner of the yard. The cool earth clung to the fur, leaving a dark, muddy print. She pressed the paw onto the paper. The image it left was a simple, messy mark, but to Naoko it felt like something more, something important. She sat back and looked at the paper. There, beneath the muddy paw print, she wrote, "I am not alone." It was a strange thing to write, a simple thing, but it was the truth. The words that had been trapped in her chest for so long, the truth she had never been able to speak aloud, found their way onto the page. It wasn't about her, captivity. It wasn't about the war. It was about the bond between her and the dog, the strange, inexplicable connection they shared. The dog didn't need to understand her. It didn't need to speak. But it was there, with her, every day. And that was enough. Naoko didn't plan to send the letter. It wasn't meant for anyone else. It was just for her, a private catharsis, a quiet rebellion against the overwhelming despair of the camp. But somehow, the letter made its way to a translator. A guard, perhaps curious, had found it among the scraps of paper and brought it to someone who could understand the words. From there, the letter passed through several hands, eventually landing in Davis's possession. He read it, the meaning of it slowly sinking in, and for the first time in a long while, he understood. The letter never reached its intended recipient. It wasn't meant to, but in some quiet way, it told a truth that words couldn't fully capture. It wasn't about survival or captivity. It was about the shared life between two beings, bound not by language, but by the simple act of being there for one another. It was a message that could only be understood in silence. If you're finding this story as powerful as we do, please like this video and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you're watching from. We'd love to hear your thoughts. The camp felt different the next morning. Something was off. The rain had stopped, but the sky hung heavy with clouds, thick and unyielding. Naoko stood at the edge of the yard, scanning the familiar space for the shape she had come to expect. Hoshiko. But there was no sign of the dog, not the familiar limping steps, not the rustling of fur in the tall grass. Just the silence of the morning. She waited. The day stretched on, and still there was no sign of Hoshiko. No barking, no movement near the fence where the dog often lay, its head resting on its paws, watching the camp with those quiet eyes. Naoko's stomach tightened as she walked the yard again, her fingers clutching the scraps she had saved from breakfast, her heart pounding in her chest. Where was the dog? The camp began to notice. It wasn't just Naoko who felt the absence. The prisoners, in their usual silence, exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something had shifted. The guards, too, watched the yard, their gazes flicking toward Naoko as she stood there, holding the scraps in her hands, staring out at the empty corner where Hoshiko should have been. By dusk, Naoko had stopped moving. She stood motionless by the fence, the scraps still clutched in her hands, her eyes fixed on the spot where the dog used to sit. Her legs were stiff from standing, her body aching with the stillness. But she refused to leave. The dog had never been gone this long before. Perhaps it had wandered off. Maybe someone had taken it, but she couldn't bring herself to believe that. Not yet. The evening crept in, the air turning cold and heavy with the weight of unspoken fears. The camp was quieter than usual, the absence of the dog leaving a void too large for anyone to ignore. A few of the prisoners had begun to whisper, but no one said anything out loud. The dog had come to mean something more than just an animal. It had become a symbol. For Naoko, for the others, it represented the small, fragile thread of humanity that had managed to survive in a place that was meant to crush it. And now, without it, the camp felt colder, darker. Naoko stood alone in the gathering dusk, her face pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, as if afraid to look away from the empty corner of the yard. She had been waiting for Hoshiko, but as the shadows lengthened and the night began to settle in, she realized she had also been waiting for something else, to see if, perhaps, this was the moment when all of it, everything, would finally slip away. The next day, Naoko woke early, her body heavy with exhaustion. The camp was eerily still. No one spoke. The guards were quiet, their eyes darting toward the empty yard, as if they too were waiting. The sun rose, casting a cold light across the barracks, and for a moment it felt like the whole world was holding its breath. And then, at the far edge of the yard, Naoko saw it. A limp figure, dragging itself toward her. The dog. Hoshiko. The relief that flooded through her was almost more than she could bear. She ran to the dog, her heart pounding, her hands trembling. When she reached it, she sank to her knees, her hands shaking as she pulled the dog close. Its body was thin, its fur matted with dirt and blood. One of its legs dragged awkwardly behind it, broken and battered, but it was alive. Then, unexpectedly, Davis reached out, his rough hand gently resting on the dog's side. And for the first time in the months they had shared this camp, he wept. The tears were quiet, his body shaking as he let out a breath. He was not crying for the dog. He was crying for something else, for the suffering that had been hidden beneath the surface of this camp, for the things that could never be fixed, for the lives that would never return. But in that moment, the reunion of Naoko and Hoshiko, fragile and uncertain though it was, became something more. It became a symbol of survival, of the strength that existed even in the most broken of beings. In that reunion, Naoko didn't just find her dog. She found a part of herself that had nearly disappeared, a reminder that even in the worst of times, life could still be found, even if it was limping, broken, and scarred. The dog had returned, and with it, something else. Months passed. The camp, once a suffocating world of dust, silence, and fear, began to shift in ways that Naoko had not thought possible. There were whispers of the war ending, of surrender and repatriation, and slowly the walls that had once seemed so impenetrable began to crumble. The American soldiers who had guarded them with such watchful eyes now looked away, spoke less, and moved with the heavy steps of men who were tired of fighting, tired of war. Nyoko's body, once so frail and broken, had begun to heal. The weight had returned to her bones, her cheeks no longer hollow from hunger. She stood taller now, her spine straighter, her eyes clearer. But even as the physical marks of captivity faded, the emotional scars remained. The day came when they called her name. Her release papers were handed to her, a thin slip of paper that promised freedom. Freedom from the barbed wire, from the guards, from the days that stretched on endlessly. She didn't know what to feel. There was no triumph in the moment, no joy to be found in walking out of the camp. Just the quiet realization that the world she would be returning to was no longer the one she remembered. The world had changed, and so had she. The gate stood before her. It was nothing grand, just a simple wooden structure with a low iron fence. But to Naoko, it felt like a threshold between two worlds, the world of captivity and the world of freedom. She stood there, holding her papers in one hand, her other hand brushing against the familiar texture of Hoshiko's fur. The dog stood beside her, its once limp body now moving with more strength, its eyes watching the same gate, waiting as if it too understood what was happening. She took a step forward, then another, her feet moving slowly toward the gate. The air outside felt different, fresher, cleaner, but also unfamiliar. The sounds were different too, the wind through the trees, the distant murmur of the world beyond. It was all so far away from the prison she had known, and yet it felt just as distant as the memories of her home. As she approached the gate, a guard stepped forward, his hand raised. For a moment, Nyoko's heart stopped. Had something gone wrong? Were they going to stop her now? The guard looked down at the dog, his brow furrowed in confusion. But then Davis stepped up beside her, his hand resting gently on the guard's arm. "Let it go," Davis said softly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that surprised them both. The guard hesitated. His eyes flicked from Nyoko to the dog, then back to Nyoko again. But there was something in Davis's tone that made him step back. With a reluctant nod, the guard lowered his hand. Naoko didn't speak. She didn't need to. She just walked through the gate, her steps slow but steady, Hoshiko padding beside her. The dog had become her companion, her witness to everything that had happened here. In the silence of their walk, Naoko felt as though they were both leaving, behind something heavy, something painful, but also something that had shaped them. She didn't look back at the camp. She didn't need to. There was no hatred in her heart, no bitterness, only a strange kind of peace. The world outside was larger than she had imagined, and yet it felt so small, so distant from the life she had left behind. She was free, and yet there was a part of her that could not shake the feeling that, In walking away from the camp, she was also leaving behind the only life she had known for so long. The woman who had entered the camp, the girl who had once been so lost, was no longer the same. She had changed, just as the world had. And beside her, walking through the gate, was the dog. Hoshiko, once just a stray, now a symbol of survival. The dog had become more than just a companion. It had become a witness to change, to the way both Naoko and the world had shifted. It had been with her through the darkest moments, through the days when hope seemed lost, and now it walked beside her into the unknown, a silent partner in the journey ahead. The war was over, but the memories, the bonds, the lessons of survival, they remained. Naoko walked on, her heart heavy but full, her steps carrying her toward something new, something she didn't know how to name, but something she would find, one step at a time. If this story moved you, please like this video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And thank you for remembering a piece of history the world nearly forgot.